Well, thank you for having me here. Really a pleasure to be joining you. And, in fact, I was going to start my short presentation almost in the same way as Angie, by describing what was the cognitive dissonance that got us to working with my colleague UAE on this project about private cities. I was thinking about this started several years ago. I was the Chief Economist for South Asia at the World Bank, and I was based in Delhi. And I was interacting a lot with urban colleagues at the World Bank. Of course, urbanization is one of the most important things that happen in developing countries, and so you want to pay attention to that. But naturally, for an organization like the World Bank, our counterparts are local governments. We work with governments, basically. Our private sector arm works with the private sector, but our counterparts are government. And a lot was going into the need to improve the capacity of the governments to plan, and to build, and to service cities. And clearly it was not working as well as you could hope for. And at the same time, next to Delhi, there was this place called Gurgaon, which was the third highest income per capita in India, now close to 2 million people, with its own metro, in addition to the Delhi metro that connects it. And it turned out that it was private, that even the metro was private. So that was some sort of cognitive dissonance. How can this happen? How can this work? And it was the aspirational place for the middle class, the rising middle class of India, to live in a place like Gurgaon. And it was hosting like half of the Fortune 500 companies' headquarters in India. At the same time, I was also spending quite a lot of time in Bangladesh, and Dhaka is probably one of the messiest cities you can think of. Very captivating, very attaching, but not the most organized place. And there was an area next to the city center, a very good area, that was ideally suited to build something new, very close, with a better planning. And the idea was there. The local government was working on this project. It was called Purbachol. And 3 decades later, there was still nobody there. There was some infrastructure, some lamp poles, nothing else. And so this tension between relatively low capacity governments, Angie described it for the county of Wuhan, and very entrepreneurial actors is what brought our attention to this. So what I will describe is this book that is now entering the production process, so probably in a month or rather 2, it should be out. So what is that we wanted to do with this book is at least to understand this, to bring to the surface something that for many people working on urban issues in development is not so visible. Because again, we are working enormously with governments. And so what is that we call private cities here? So it's major urban areas in whose development and management a significant non-government actor played an important role. So two elements that are important here. One is major urban areas. So we are not interested in gated communities. We are not interested in industrial parks. We're interested really in cities, the places that connect people and jobs. So it has to be considered a private city in our terminology, it has to have that dimension. Again, a point that Angie made about the old industrial park. And second is non-government actor. And by non-government actor, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is a large developer. But what we found as we started looking in more detail is that it's not necessarily large developers. We found business associations. We found civil society organizations behind urbanization. And so we use the word private cities basically to emphasize the agency. So who is driving this? It relates, of course, to other concepts, new cities, of course. But we didn't use the term new cities for a couple of reasons. One is that many of these private cities are not new. Some go even 1 century back, the ones we studied. And second, they do not necessarily result from this kind of outsourcing, where a government with low capacity reaches out to some private actor that can do it, and some deal is structured. Some of them emerged without government participation. Some of them emerged against government. In the case of civil society, the case we studied was in Bolivia, was a case where there was deliberate neglect of ethnic minority people in the country, and they organized themselves and to try to get services and build a city. So for that reason, we think it's new cities is a subset of the private cities. Charter cities, of course, is the other concept that comes to mind. But in the charter cities idea, a lot of what you do in a place is to change the business environment. All of a sudden, you operate under the laws of the UK or Switzerland or whatever it is. So it's how you conduct business that becomes very central. While here, what we were interested in is how you assemble land, how you build infrastructure. So it's still on the urban side. Other concepts, competitive cities, our colleagues at the IFC, the International Financial Corporation, and the World Bank, have this idea, which is how you really target a sector, regardless of whether you are private or public, and make a place is a form of place-based policies to attract a sector. But some of them, like the case I mentioned in Bolivia, were not driven by a business logic. They were driven by a need to develop a place where there could be housing and jobs. Now, these are the 14 cities we studied, and of course one of the case studies was Guam, and it was with Professor Shuki Shong and colleagues. These were the 14 cities we studied in detail. I will go to them soon. What I want to show is that you find them everywhere. You find them in countries at very different levels of development, from low income to middle income, even high middle income. Very different legal and cultural backgrounds, very different political systems. You find it in China and in Vietnam, but you also find them in South Africa or in Nigeria. So what that suggests is that these entities emerge when there is an untapped need for urbanization, when governments are not doing what they are supposed to do to get cities going, and someone else jumps in, either for profit or for need or whatever it is. Now, private cities are present, of course. When you think, there was a very interesting background paper by a colleague of Professor Shuki Kung Sen, who did a historic study. And when you go back in history, of course, a lot of cities were not done by governments. Medieval Paris was run by the boatsmen guild. Even if you see the Paris, the symbol of Paris, it still has a boat. They were running. Renaissance Florence was the city of the Medici. Company towns were everywhere in Europe and especially in the US during the Industrial Revolution. So there were many examples, but there are also examples today. We think of Washington, D.C. as the planned city, the symbol, the political symbol. It was designed by L'Enfant. It had all the ideas of the alignment. Well, some of the biggest private cities of the US are in Washington, D.C. This Crystal City, I took my plane there this morning. Crystal City is the biggest single development by a large developer. That's where Amazon headquarters 2 will go. And it's not the only one. There are 3 of these cities. If you go to Washington, D.C. and you drive from the Dallas airport to the center of the city, you cross Reston. Reston is a private city. So part of Washington, D.C., that we will think, oh, that's, if you want a symbol, that's a symbol city, is to a large extent a private city. That is another story that is not well known. That's Saclay, near Paris. And Saclay is an agricultural plateau that became very prosperous because of the drainage that was done for Versailles Palace. But the farmers there became very powerful. So they managed to block, is an example of NIMBYism, they managed to block any urbanization there. They wanted to continue with the land also for philosophical reasons. They didn't want wild urbanization. So when you look at this, you see an area that has 800,000 people in like 40-something communes all around, and then you have this agricultural place in the middle. And who saw the opportunity? Research centers. Paris-Saclay is now one of the top universities. 15% of R&D of France is done there, and it's private, public, semi-public. So you have examples in advanced economies. But what called our attention is that when we look at the 14 cities we studied, is that they are on a bigger scale. So here what you have is, for comparison, Reston, which is the biggest private city we are aware of in the United States, the land area, the population, and then the last three columns are how do these cities compare in terms of population with the number 1 city in the country, number 10 city by size, and number 20. And you see that Reston is less than 1% of New York, and 6% more or less of city number 10. I don't remember which one it was. When you look at the median of our 14 cities, they are basically between city number 10 and city number 20 in these countries. So these are serious entities, and the median population, you see, is almost 1 million in this group of cities. We could have chosen more than these 14. We stopped at some point, but these ones are remarkable. So one thing we did, let me start by the analytical framework rather than finishing as Angie did, was just to try to see in the literature what we could find in relation to these cities. And we found that there are two traditions about them. One is from urban economics, and it mainly refers to gated communities, business improvement districts, and one is from political science, where these large developers in general are not very much appreciated in terms of the political implications and how the cities run. And so what we did is a simple game theory model where you have two players, a local government, a large developer, but the local government is not fully capable to develop the city, which the private actor is. But the private actor doesn't have enough clout to appropriate all the surplus that the city generates. So from both sides, you have an imperfection. One is not efficient enough, it's not at the frontier. The other cannot appropriate as much as the city generates because there's spillovers and others benefit. And so you get, depending on how the game is played, you get basically 5 equilibrium for a locality. Nobody develops land and you get a rural area. When only the private actor develops land, you get the company town. When only the local government develops land, you get a commercial city. And in the middle, you get these two things, which differ on whether the government is playing strategically. If the government is playing strategically, it can use its decision on how much land to develop to either crowd in or crowd out the private actor. And we find that it is in the interest of the government to crowd in the private actor. But it's still inefficient because you are combining two actors who play inefficiently. So the question is there a better way to get this? And I will get to that at the end. So what we did from an empirical point of view, so this was more or less the analytical framework, was first for 4 countries, we tried to do an inventory of how many of these private cities we could find. And numbers vary, you can see, but we are talking, again, as Angie referred to the case of China, between 500 and 3,000. Well, we didn't find those many in these countries, but we still found quite a few, and we tried to classify them in terms of the model. And then for the 14 cities you saw in the map, we basically did a study using exactly the same structure. So who is the private player? How did the private player interact with the government? Where is this place, where is the city located? How it is connected to markets? What was the timeline of events? What is the institutional status, which is something very interesting, is that these are evolving cities. Most of them end up being conventional cities at one point. It's not like forever. How was the land assembly? One of the most difficult things. How was the land assembly process conducted? What is the economic activity in the place? What are the amenities and services? What are the social and environmental issues? And I will come to them because they are important. And how was land value capture processed? So who really appropriated the surplus of this city? So let me just give a few insights. First, we found that there are like 4 conditions for these private cities to emerge. First is the location. All of the cities we studied are very near a major urban agglomeration or a very important port or natural resources that are very important. So location, they are within less than 100 kilometers from a major agglomeration in general. Second is there has to be a government that cannot do the job or does not want to do the job. Cases of not wanting to do the job, I refer to Bolivia. South Africa with apartheid was another interesting example, and one of our cities is in South Africa. Third is the private actors are not just your ordinary builder or developer. These are extraordinary private actors with capacity to implement at scale. Some of them, like Ciputra in Indonesia, are working on dozens of cities at the same time. They have innovative business models. The case of Guam, having all of these research department, understanding what are the industries and even supporting industries to locate. They can be very cohesive in terms of collective action. When Sialkot, which is the biggest industrial center of Pakistan, is a city run by a business association. And is a business association that is extremely cohesive and solves rewriting problems because it goes back to a tradition, the Baridari system, that is centuries old of social relations involving the elders of the community. And they may have the ability to influence policies, which is something I will come to because it's the political science dimension. And when I say influence policies, it can be quite radical. One of our cities is San Pedro Sula. That's where the expression banana republic comes from, okay? Some samurai of the United Fruit went with an army of mercenaries to take the place. So that's land assembly. That's a way of doing land assembly that is quite radical. So we are talking about political influence at different levels, but quite often is the ability to influence even national policies in favor of these cities. We found that not all these actors take on the same function. So here you have 5 columns on the right. 3 are traditional functions of a local government. You assemble land, you put infrastructure, you improve the connectivity, you plan, you provide services, so the use of the land goes with it. Here, dark green means the private actor did it fully, light green is partially, but you see that there are many blanks in this recall. So there were things that were done by governments, even if the private actor was very important. These private actors were extremely opportunistic in terms of being near an airport, a highway, things that were there that were not provided by them. But then there are 2 things that are not conventional that we find, and again, quite common, not across the board. One is the business development story. So again, like one being an extreme, but we find several cases of that sort, perhaps not as stellar, but still quite remarkable. And then the political activism. So these people are so powerful, these entities are so powerful that they are also involved in the politics. For instance, in the case of Bolivia, in El Alto, when Evo Morales reaches the presidency, Evo Morales is the candidate of these entities from El Alto who use that presidency to finally get infrastructure for the city and so on and so forth. So it's a mixture of traditional functions and non-traditional functions. We discussed how was the land value capture done. And so this, just to summarize, this has a time horizon, of course, but if you think in terms of present value of incomes, this is what happened in the locality when it was rural. It was original residents and firms, the farmers, whoever was there that was making some income. And then you have the city that develops. And you have new residents and firms that come. You have the private actor itself. You have government that taxes. And what we find is that, of course, you need financial viability for this to work. So the private actor needs to recover what was invested in the city for it to be a viable deal. But the political viability will require that you also have Pareto efficiency, that nobody's worse off or not significantly worse off. And what we find from our model is that there is an efficient solution to the problem, which is in the spirit of PPP, let's say, but the efficient solution is not Pareto efficient. So it's efficient from an economic point of view, but for it to work, the private developer, the large investor, whoever it is, takes a big chunk. And so if you want to do it in a Pareto efficiency way, you need to think, so how will you capture back? And how will you redistribute? And we found that in practice, there is a lot of creativity on how this is done. Of course, the most obvious way to recover is you tax. Property tax is not well developed in developing countries, but if you have all these businesses, you have companies, you have corporate income tax, you have value-added tax or whatever, so you get a significant flow. Another way, which is the case of Guan or is the case of Fumihung in Vietnam, is you sell the rights to the city. So this place is yours, and we get a deal for how long you have it, or in the case of Guan, it was for 50 years given to the developer. In the case of Fumihung, they created a corporation between the local government and the large developer, and they split 70-30. The proceeds from the city, but that's a way of selling the rights to the city, like what you will think of in terms of Coase theorem and law and economics approach. There is direct surplus appropriation. India found very creative ways, for instance, to keep villages within the city as villages, so that the residents benefit from the urbanization around. So in a way, they become shareholders because they have part of the land of the new city. But sometimes that was done even explicitly, exchanging land for shares of the company that was building the city. So that's a different, you're not selling, you're making them shareholders. And finally, there is a lot that is done through litigation, through defaults, through conflicts. So this was not what was planned. It happened, for instance, that there are a lot of stories of land grabbing in the cities, and there is a lot of litigation that goes into that, with government stepping in, demonstrations. There are defaults. What will happen with China Fortune Land Development? Once you have the obligations and you go bankrupt, who will pick up that bill? And then there is conflict. The story of San Pedro Sula in Honduras as a banana center of the world ended with a gigantic strike by the workers. The banana strike of 1954, that basically pushed the companies out and created the conditions for the new generation, the maquila, the light manufacturing businesses, to say, oh, this is a good place. It has the infrastructure and it has a lot of labor that now is completely unemployed. Now, there are shortcomings of cities. First, and again, as Angie said, is there are white elephants. The 14 that we looked at are the ones that were successful. They are there. They have, as I said, a median of almost 1 million people. But we found some that never took off. In general, because the location was not good, or because the arrangements with the government were not conducive. Now, there are also enormous amounts of white elephants in cities developed by government. So it's not to say that, oh, you have white elephants when you have a private actor, and you need to compare what the alternative is. You have cases of serious environmental degradation and disaster risk, and you could think, oh, it makes sense. These private players do not care about the externalities, so someone will have to deal with them. But it's not true across the board, because some of them, their value proposition is to be extremely green. So some of our 14 cities are among the best, the cleanest cities that you can find in those countries. If you want a place that is has decent environment, and Fumihung, for instance, in Vietnam, there is social segregation. That's Eco-Atlantic in Nigeria, next to the center of Lagos. So Eco-Atlantic is a quite radical thing, because someone just filled land, sand, across from Lagos, like put a Manhattan. Like you were at the coast, and then now you have an island in front, not even an island. And that's and city. And you see the difference between these just kilometers, couple of miles distance between the downtown Lagos and Ecuador. And then there are even cases of institutional secession, like the cities not being run with the same rules as the country. Happens typically with crime. These cities, part of the value proposition tends to be that they are safer, but they can get to safety by having rules that are not the same. How do you define the presumption of innocence in some of them works very differently from the rest of the country. It can go also in other ways. If you take Waterfall City in South Africa, which where the private actors, a family that really fought to protect the land throughout apartheid, is a very devout Muslim family. So in Waterfall City, you don't mess up with alcohol, and you don't build churches, and you don't build synagogues. So you have all of a sudden these cities can have rules that are different. So what are the implications, and I finish with this, what are the implications for urban policy in developing countries from this? First is what I started with my surprise in seeing Gurgaon and in seeing Dhaka, is that just development local capacity and having stronger governments, of course, is the idea, is the first place. But it may take forever. As I said, Purvachal outside Dhaka has been for decades there. Before that government has the capacity to develop Purvachal, we may have a few more decades, and urbanization is happening now. So that's a missed opportunity. But in the analytical model, we also show that it can be suboptimal for a perverse second best effect. Is that a government that has more capacity will be more inclined to develop land because it has a greater capacity, and it may crowd out the private actor who could do it better. So we have a proof that for some range of very low capacity, at the time when you are improving the capacity of the local government, you might be making things worse off, even if you need it eventually get it to high capacity government. Second option we studied in the model is what happens if you ban private actors. Okay, we don't want you into this business. Cities are a part of the collective, whatever. It can be very inefficient because there are places where you don't get urbanization at all, which is probably a worse outcome. So it's better to think in terms of a PPP, public-private partnership arrangement, and that's probably what was implicit in the case of Guam, what was in the case of Fumihung, what was as a government-to-government agreement. One of our private cities has a government of another country behind it, and that's Batam in Indonesia, where Singapore wanted space for its factories, and basically it's the government of Singapore that strikes a deal with the government of Indonesia. So it's a government-to-government partnership, and the city of Batam is built essentially by Singaporean companies. So that kind of public-private partnership seems very appealing, but it has several issues that need attention. It's not like, okay, get into a PPP and this will work. The experience in development with PPPs is full of failures because of problems with design. First is comparative advantage. You remember the columns with the green, dark green, and light green? In certain areas, like land assembly, even weak capacity governments may still have an advantage compared to private actors. Second is, in PPPs, time inconsistency issues are extremely serious. And here the time inconsistencies are enormous. First, because if you are investing in a city, you have a sunk investment that you cannot take back. So once you have built a city, you are stuck with it, and you could be expropriated, you could be taken. And also it happens through political mechanisms. Once you build a city, you have a political constituency. Once you have a political constituency, people vote, and so the control is lost compared to the initial situation. And then there are these social and environmental issues I raised, that if they are not addressed, they will not be solved. So you need to explicitly think, what will you do about social segregation? What will you do about the risk of institutional secession? So it's not just go and do your PPP and this will solve it, and we see this as the next area for us to study with UA is how should we think about these things. Thank you very much.